He's literally gone halfway around the world. Now, after a 27-hour flight, what can Emmanuel Macron do with his surprise visit to New Caledonia? Critics see deadly riots in the French Pacific island as a crisis of his own government's making, what with an electoral reform that indigenous Kanaks say dilutes their voice in upcoming provincial elections. Sovereigntists loyal to Paris point to longstanding residents who don't have the rights to vote. They say that's not fair. The last time New Caledonia witnessed this kind of eruption was the 1980s. Then, too, it was electoral reform that lit the spark. It ended with a carefully worded deal that granted a special status to an overseas collectivity, which the United Nations to this day still lists as an occupied colony. We'll ask what it means in the 21st century to fly a French flag in a land that's more than 17,000 kilometers away from Paris. Remember, the majority like it that way in New Caledonia. How strategic is a South Pacific island that's in Australia's backyard, patrolled often those waters by the United States, and coveted by China? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about Emmanuel Macron's trip to New Caledonia. With us joining us from Honolulu is historian David Chappelle, professor of Pacific History at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the author of The Kanak Awakening, The Rise of Nationalism in New Caledonia. Welcome to the show, or good morning, I should say.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
From Washington, historian Patricia O'Brien, adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Francois.
And we say good evening to David Camroux, who is adjunct professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Good to see you.
Pleasure.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, they call it the rock. New Caledonia that's how the locals describe the island state, the island territory, and it's again been rocked to its core. 6 killed in 10 days of rioting, including 2 gendarmes, prompting that surprise trip by the French president. Laurent Berstecker has more.
Hoping to appease tensions after a week-long political crisis, Emmanuel Macron traveled to New Caledonia on Tuesday in a bid to restore order to the riot-hit territory. Speaking at the National Assembly, which held a minute's silence to honor those who lost their lives in the violence, French Prime Minister Gabriel Attal was confident the president's visit would help usher in a return to calm.
He will hold talks with all actors of New Caledonian society, political parties, civil society actors, young people, economic actors, and indigenous groups. The aim is to be by their side and to start laying the groundwork to rebuild.
Violence erupted last week after French MPs approved a bill to change New Caledonia's electoral laws. It would allow residents who've lived in the territory for at least 10 years to vote in provincial elections, a change the indigenous Kanak people say will further erode their rights. After a week of riots that saw hundreds of businesses pillaged and several people killed, calm slowly returned on Tuesday, with French military and police continuing to clear out roadblocks. But some Kanak activists vowed they would keep protesting until the bill was scrapped.
We won't give up until they withdraw the text. No, we won't give up, even if we have to die for it. We'll stay here on the roadblocks.
Pro-independence leaders have blamed the riots on Macron and accused him of forcing the unpopular reform through parliament. Some took to social media on Tuesday to criticize the president's visit and warned it could end up adding more fuel to the fire.
David Cameron, were you surprised to hear Emmanuel Macron saying he was going to fly to New Caledonia?
I was both surprised and not surprised. Not surprised in the sense that he's created a problem of his own making. And the problem really goes back, in my view, to the referendum held in 2021. Despite the opposition of the Kanaks because of COVID, they asked for the referendum to be postponed because they were in a mourning period for those who'd been killed by COVID. And Emmanuel Macron didn't listen. Why didn't he listen? Because New Caledonia has a new importance for President Macron. It makes France an Indo-Pacific nation. And that is the key. It's really no longer just a domestic concern. It's a geopolitical concern for the President of the Republic.
A geopolitical concern, an economic one too, with the vast nickel deposits, or is that simply perhaps overblown?
Well, the problem is that the price of nickel has fallen dramatically, and New Caledonia produces, I think, just about 1/10 of the production of Indonesia, which is the world's largest nickel producer, which is just next door. And those nickel mines actually need subsidies at the moment. But yes, there is an economic concern because those mines do employ lots and lots of people, including lots of Kanaks.
All right, back in 1985, there was another spike in tensions in New Caledonia and another French president who sprung the same surprise.
Jusqu'à aller en Nouvelle-Calédonie.
Vous êtes allé au Liban?
Mais oui, madame, j'irai en Nouvelle-Calédonie.
Peut-on
Quand?
savoir quand?
Demain.
Vous partez demain?
Demain.
Demain jeudi.
Demain jeudi.
So there you see Christine O'Krent from French television asking him, you've been to Lebanon recently. Will you be going to New Caledonia? Yes, I will. Tomorrow, he says. David Chappelle, you remember that?
Yes, I remember the 1980s period in New Caledonia. It was even more disruptive than what's going on at present. And I think that could have been avoided also.
What parallels can we draw between this surprise visit and that surprise visit?
Well, the way I look at the long term of New Caledonian history, there are a lot of zigzags, you might say, in the way France was working with or not working with the indigenous people and their desires for independence. They had 100 years of brutal colonization, lost 90% of their lands, confined to reserves, and had no civil rights. Then that changed right after World War II when they suddenly got voting rights and citizenship. And that began a whole new era of decolonization in the territory under a multiracial political party called the Caledonian Union. And they even achieved autonomy in 1957. But here's where the plot thickens. The next year, when President Charles de Gaulle came to power, he had the same kind of vision that Macron has today about being a world power and wanting to play a big role. And he also wanted to keep control of the nickel industry. So he took away New Caledonia's autonomy during the 1960s. And there was a nickel boom because of the American war in Vietnam. So about 25,000 new migrants came into the territory. That was actively encouraged by Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer also. So that completely changed the demography of New Caledonia, and the Kanak became a minority for the first time in their country. And that's what led to the crisis in the 1980s, where polarization had grown because of a Kanak nationalist movement, and the settlers became very militant themselves and refusing to make concessions to them. So that's the context for the clip that you just showed us.
Patricia O'Brien, it's again, do you look at New Caledonia through the lens of majority rule today or who historically the land belongs to?
I think that you really need to, I mean, if France wants to keep New Caledonia, it has to definitely, and if it wants to be a power in the Pacific, it definitely needs to pay close attention to the indigenous population, because New Caledonia is relatively unique in the Pacific in that it is still in a colonial type of relationship with France amongst a whole lot of indigenous self-ruled nations. And if France really wants to be part of the region, it very much has to pay close attention to the well-being and the political aspirations of its indigenous peoples. And France has really set itself back since 2021, and particularly as it's kept up this really hard line against independence, the independence movement in New Caledonia, that the region it's triggered the region to look, to go back to France when France was seen as very combative and France was seen as not a good player in the region. And France sort of put itself back there again.
You say a hardline stance. How so and why?
Well, I think the hardline stance comes from, not listening to independence voices, driving through reforms where, recognising the third referendum as a valid vote when the independence movement, as we've had explained, very clearly said it was not. And, very few people in the region accept it as a valid expression of the will of the people. And so I think that that's sort of like the issues that France has to really grapple with. And because it hasn't grappled with it, because it's pushed things through, that particularly because decisions are being made in Paris that have a huge impact in New Caledonia, that this triggers a whole lot of ill feeling against France, because every part of the Pacific has relationships and history, colonial histories, and this is what people are seeing kind of reborn at the moment, and it's not a good place for France to be.
The French president then taking his bag and catching a plane to the other side of the planet. Now, there was less rioting overnight, but there was more destruction still. The ransacking of a construction company, a car dealership was gutted. Schools as well. The damage so far estimated by insurers at €1 billion. Macron's visit met with mixed expectations.
Let's hope that this visit by Mr. Macron and Mr. Darmanin will have a positive impact for the country, because it's chaos at the moment.
He's coming too late, after all the massacres.
It's going to make things worse, because he's already got a bad reputation here, and this is just going to add to the animosity.
So there you see mixed reactions, David Cameron, to this visit.
I think that's understandable. I mean, after the Matignon agreement and then the new agreement.
This is 1988?
And 1998.
Right.
So the French state was seen, to a certain extent, as a kind of neutral arbitrator. That there wasn't, strongly taking sides one way or the other. And that changed under President Macron, particularly pushing through this third referendum.
His first prime minister, Edouard Philippe, was considered an even broker by many.
That's right. And there had been a long history of efforts made of reconciliation.
So what happened after? Why?
I'm thinking back of the 1980s and Bernard Pons when he was interior minister. You start playing the nationalist flag, the loyalist flag, and so the French state and President Macron is no longer considered as a kind of neutral referee. He's considered to be on the side of the loyalists. So this is going to make, and he's going to spend 24 hours and set up a committee or something. Come on, let's be serious.
Yeah, and by the way, and you heard the woman there talking about his interior minister in that clip. Macron to be flanked by the outspoken Gérald Darmanin, the same one who drew the ire of Liverpool fans when he blamed them for the tear gas and mayhem ahead of the 2022 Champions League final in Paris. Last week, he accused Azerbaijan of stoking tensions in New Caledonia with a disinformation campaign. Azerbaijan, which is at daggers drawn these days with France over Paris's support for Armenia. Now, for investigative newsweekly Le Canard Enchaîné, Darmanin's claims are a smokescreen for calls that had been unheeded. The High Commissioner, Louis Lefranc, had warned the government of a risk of rioting, says a source, which did not prevent a frightening lack of preparation on the part of the state when it all erupted last week. Is this the Interior Minister's fault, David Cameron?
I think there was certainly a failure, for example, to understand the alienation of young Kanaks. And, there are some very fine specialists in France and in New Caledonia that know what is happening on the ground, and they were not listened to. And that's, again, the difference, in the period of the 30-year period where prior to the last referendum, in which these people were listened to, and a way of reconciliation, at least of dialogue between loyalists and independentists was found. And that's been sort of thrown away.
There's been more police reinforcements, David Chappelle, that have been sent to New Caledonia. But you have, on the one hand, the roadblocks. We saw them in that opening report. And on the other hand, these neighborhood sort of vigilante groups or crime protection units, I don't know how you want to call them, that have also been set up. It's very tense in New Caledonia.
Yes, it's a terrible situation. I feel very badly for all New Caledonians because of this enormous amount of disruption and destruction. And it, I think, could have been foreseen, as people have been saying. Macron basically jumped the gun by trying to push through the voting rights change unilaterally, basically through the French Parliament, instead of having a negotiation first, because the Nouméa Accord requires that even after the referendums, and especially the doubtful third referendum where 56% of voters didn't even participate, the Nouméa Accord said at that point, after the referendums, whatever the outcome, everyone is supposed to sit down at the table and negotiate a new arrangement. And that did not happen.
Could it happen yet? Because the president has said he could make. The president has said he could make concessions. There's even talk that he won't ratify the new electoral reform bill, which now must go to a joint session of Parliament.
That would be a wise decision. First of all, eliminate that bone of contention and get people talking. I'm a little doubtful that his going there today with the Minister of the Army and the Minister of the Interior, who already has a bad reputation in the country, that the trio are going to be able to make any significant progress. I think what they're really showing is France is showing a show of force, that they will bring order again. But they've talked about having a mission of dialogue that I think should include a diverse array of participants, not only in New Caledonia, but among the French political spectrum. For example, the overseas territories and Parliament have offered to send people to help with the negotiations. There needs to be a very broad-based conversation.
And we were talking earlier about indigenous Kanaks, who make up an estimated 40% of New Caledonia's population today. And as our panel's been saying, the gulf between them and the European origin Caldoches, as they're known, is a vast one. Antonia Kerrigan has that story.
Present for thousands of years before French colonisation, many members of the indigenous Kanak community in New Caledonia feel France has no business governing the territory, located 16,000 miles away from its mainland.
All the Kanaks ask is to be recognised in their own country and to be allowed to run the country themselves. If you go to Fiji, it's run by Fijians. It's only here in New Caledonia that when you arrive you find other people in the authorities.
The Kanak-led separatist movement first gained momentum in the 1980s, leading to something resembling a short-lived but bloody civil war. Agreements made in the 80s and 90s laid out a roadmap towards referenda on self-determination for the island range, calming the violence. But after none of the three plebiscites held delivered a vote for independence, the territory's status is once again up in the air. Since the 1998 Nouméa Agreement, the New Caledonian Electoral Register has been closed to new arrivals in the territory, a move to prevent the dilution of the indigenous vote. But after a constitutional change voted through the National Assembly this month promised to reopen the Electoral Register, allowing in 25,000 new voters, only 12,000 of whom are indigenous, Kanak activists cry provocation.
Le dégel du corps électoral, ce n'est pas un discours de maintenant.
The dilution of the electorate is not a new issue. We've been warning them for some time, and they know that it's a divisive issue. They know that they're undermining the Nouméa Accords with this kind of rhetoric.
An already marginalised community, the Kanak people are twice as likely to be unemployed as the rest of the population, and only 8% of them complete higher education, compared to 54% in the European community of the island range.
And we can welcome to our conversation from Singapore, political scientist, former French diplomat Fred Constant. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Yeah.
This is we see that there are two sides on this. On the one hand, those who state, as we heard that activist say, that the deals have been broken. On the other hand, those who claim that, well, there are people now with those voter rolls that have been frozen for decades, people who live in New Caledonia all these years and who cannot vote. What's the right way to go about it now?
Yeah, well, what happened was very predictable, because what we are witnessing over the past day is a direct consequence of unilateral political move by the French national authorities. We need to go back to the spirit of the agreement signed, years ago under Martignan and then Nouméa, political framework agreements. That means that we need to reach agreement between the two camps rather than, imposing any unilateral solution conceived only at the national level. And I think that the visit that President Macron is having now to New Caledonia is a fantastic symbolic gesture, provided that he took the right decisions. And when I say that, I mean, in the first place, that he would have to withdraw the constitutional reform about the electorate, which is under discussion now. And secondly, I think that it would be a good decision that he commission a committee, what officially he's going to do, of independent political personalities that will renew the dialogue in the territory.
So what you're saying, for Fred Constant, is you don't think he'd be making this 27-hour journey from Paris to Nouméa if he wasn't going there to hit pause on this electoral reform?
Yeah, I think he would do it. I think he would do it. But from now, I don't have any confirmation. I think that would be a pointless visit if he were not to take this political move. I think he badly needs to calm down things now and restore peace and dialogue. Without, there would be no solution possible, because the tension is very high, as you can see, and he has to cancel the Congress. The French Parliament was to meet in Congress to
joint session,
adopt the constitutional reform about the electorate. He has to cancel that and to give the two camps enough time to find a compromise, which would be acceptable by both camps.
By both sides. David Cameron, Emmanuel Macron, there's a chance for him to play good cop to his interior minister's bad cop?
There is that possibility, because the cost...
He's done it before, right?
Right. And the costs for France are not just in New Caledonia, but they're also in relation to the neighborhood. I mean, one of the consequences of those two agreements was that France was perceived, both in Australia and New Zealand, and also in some of the Pacific Islands, as a responsible, neighbor within the South Pacific. And that has been sacrificed as well on pandering to the loyalists in New Caledonia.
Patricia O'Brien, images of stranded Australian tourists making their way home finally. Is that going to sour the mood? What with Australia, which has been going a long way to mend ties with France since it broke that submarine deal a few years back.
Yes, Australia's got to tread a very fine line because, on the one hand, Australia does not want to see further conflict in its neighbourhood, in its region. Just earlier this year, there was riots in Port Moresby, which different causes than the ones in New Caledonia, but nonetheless, the images that you were showing of Noumea, look very much like what was happening in Port Moresby just a few months ago. So all of these things, Australia does not want instability in the region. These things are extremely, bad for all people in the region, but there's the additional layer of the geopolitical issue as well, particularly with the issue of China, which I'm sure we're going to come to. So Australia has to be very careful. And I think what Australia's tactic is going to be is to make sort of benign comments about, saying that there should be calm and that there should be talks. But I think Australia is going to very much step behind what the Pacific Islands Forum is going, the statements that they're going to make about what's happening in New Caledonia. And over the last couple of days, there's been some very strong statements coming out from the Pacific Islands Forum about the way that France has basically, brought this situation about, and that now France needs to fix it.
France needs to fix it. Those Pacific Island states, they're jostling between superpowers these days, those that are closer to China, those that are not. Patty, when you look at the statement like the one that can come out from that regional body, do you look at it at face value, or do you see the unseen hand of China?
Oh, I think that what is the much bigger force there is like the historical memory of colonialism, which, as I said, is, extremely powerful. And I think what people are seeing in New Caledonia is very much so many parts of the Pacific have gone through very similar experiences over the past 100 years, but, it's still a very triggering footage to see forces coming into a country and trying to quell unrest. So I think that China is very much in the background, but I think people are much more worried about the resolution of colonial legacies and about these colonial legacies being resolved in good faith. And I think that that's what has not happened here, and where Macron has really set things back. And it'll be interesting to see how he can turn things around.
David Chappelle, well, you're sitting in Honolulu. Is it people see it through the prism of liberation struggle from colonialism, or do they see superpower tensions in the Pacific?
Well, there's a mixture. Actually, many people in Hawaii don't know much about New Caledonia. We're kind of far off the grid up in the northern part of the Pacific. But those who do work with the South Pacific countries and Pacific studies and so forth, they definitely feel that this is part of a superpower struggle, because Hawaii is also the headquarters of the United States Central Pacific Command, and they have their ideas of competing with China in the region, while the Chinese have their ideas of trying to control certain islands against the United States and Australia, for example. So there are many factors involved, but the basic one, I think, is the long-term Kanak struggle, which has been an ongoing process. And I wanted to mention briefly that within the loyalist category, there is variety. So is there is variety among the Kanaks. Some are loyalists, and there are some Caledonians who support the movement, who are not Kanak. Among the loyalists, a big group is the Polynesians, who are 20% of the population. And they have a party that works closely with the Kanak parties to deal with socioeconomic issues because there's still enormous inequality in the country. But they come up short in supporting independence. So the map is a little bit more complex than portraying loyalists versus Kanak. And it should be mentioned that the Europeans are not the majority of the population.
Fred Constant, when you think back, in a previous life, you were an advisor to a préfet in the French Caribbean, state superintendent. Your thoughts when you're listening to the complex patchwork described there by David Chappelle?
Yeah. Again, what I see is that we need to get the two leaders of the main leaders of the two sides around a table and to give them enough time to reach a compromise. There is room for maneuver, provided that the state allow each side to, take the necessary steps forward. And within the population, you would see that in each side, you would see that there are a large majority of the loyalists, large majority within the independentists, who ask only one thing: first, to restore peace, and two, to reach peacefully a compromise. What we had over the past, let's say, 25 to 30 years was a unique process of decolonization. And it's a pity to see that it took less than a week to win it. And now we have to drive the two camps back on the right track of a peaceful negotiation of a compromise. Most of the people living in this island want to live together, but the Kanaks, the Melanesian side, no longer wants to be the one who is sacrificed on the altar of the raison d'etat.
And I think the point that David Chappelle made is very important. Of the 20% of the population who are neither Kanak nor Caldoche, the Polynesian, the people from the Wallis and Futuna, who are a significant part of the population as well.
And you have this. Is this a unique case, New Caledonia, or are there other far-flung places, far from what is, I don't know if we can call it the colonial power or the mainland?
It is somewhat of a unique case. I mean, in the literature, the historical literature, we talk about colonies of settlement and colonies of alien rule.
Because when Argentina and the UK fight a war over the Malvinas, the Falklands, the local population is 98% in favor of the British. So in this case, the island split.
Yes, and not, as David Chappelle has made the point, not just between independentists and loyalists, but it's a bit much more nuanced than that. And that's why the agreements of the last 30 years had been so effective, because they did allow this dialogue between different opinions, different views, and different social groups in a spirit of respect. And that's what was lost, for me, after the forced third independence. Because what happened after the third independence is President Macron went back to New Caledonia. He made a speech in Sydney in Australia talking about France as an Indo-Pacific nation. And he made this very strong declaration in Noumea that, the people of New Caledonia have decided to remain French. And yet that referendum was not considered legitimate, as Patricia has pointed out.
Is it a case, Patricia, I'm sorry to rub salt in the wound because you're a professor of Pacific Studies in the United States, that just people in Paris just didn't keep their eye on the ball, they just don't know that much about what's happening in their own territories?
That's possibly, the case, that people have been listening to the statements by the government about, how, what a great thing it is that people want to stay part of France and that the status quo is going to be continued. And I think if that's what they believe, then there has been definitely a muting of the voices of people from the region, because there has been, since 2021, it's been extremely clear that the independence side of things has not seen this vote as legitimate, and that there has been, they want to see a third referendum held again. And so, that's going to be the starting point for, I would think that Macron will have to put that on the table as something, and then he has to accept the terms, what the outcome of that is. And that could be very, given that there's such a surge in independence feeling, that France may not like the result. And then what? That's the big question. But a country like Australia does not want to see France leave New Caledonia. So, because that allows China a way in to into an independent state. And so there's a whole lot of interests that are conflicting. But yes, if people in France believe what they've been told by the government, then they've been seriously, misinformed.
Yeah, there we talked about economics, we talked about politics. There's a bit of, I guess you could say, linguistic pride sometimes, David Cameron. New Caledonia's neighbor, this Vanuatu. Before 1980, it was jointly administered by Britain and France. Since independence, number of French speakers has plummeted there. Your thoughts on, when you speak with colleagues at Sciences Po, is there a bit of that? Well, yeah, it's terrible and everything, but it's our
I think
it's our territory. It's our French flag to fly there.
Yes, I think. Well, I think there's a little bit of the cultural element to it, but I think that more important is this sort of discourse about France as an Indo-Pacific nation. And remember that.
Does that make sense in 2024?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, if you look in terms of maritime, exclusive economic zones, I think France is the second, or I'm not sure, the largest maritime power in the world. So that is very important. I mean, it's unlike, that's a very difference with the British, who got rid of the confetti of empire. The French are probably quite wisely hung on to what, in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean. And made efforts to integrate that into the larger nation. It's interesting. I was talking to one of my students from the Reunion Islands, how they look at what's happening in New Caledonia.
Also of the French Indian Ocean island, the Reunion, yeah.
And again, the key word that comes out is respect. Respect for the indigenous people, and taking that into account in the way you govern in those territories.
David Chappelle. Is it harder for France to justify a presence in New Caledonia today than it was 40 years ago? And similarly, what to say when the United States has overseas commonwealths like Puerto Rico?
Well, how to justify an overseas territory? That can be a big subject to discuss. I think the United States has not always dealt well with its overseas territories. And these days, with the globalization of the world economy and also geopolitical competition, these overseas territories, as in World War II, become outposts of what the reigning power says are the good guys. So it's difficult. And then you get the complex internal situation, which frankly is a kind of conundrum politically, I think, because of the diversity of the people and their various histories in the territory. But what I think is essential is not to have unilateral, dramatic actions from Paris without consulting in New Caledonia and reach an agreement of some kind on the next step. I think that's what's been missing basically under President Macron.
Back in March, France's president traveled to another overseas dependency, French Guyana. It's a department, and it gives France and the European Union a foothold on the South American continent. Fred Constant, the fact that the sun never sets on the French flag or around the globe, your thoughts on that? Should that still be the case in the 21st century?
It depends on the circumstances, I would say. For sure, for France, there is a huge, geopolitical issue. What is at stake is the capacity of France to be, let's say, a medium major actor, in the global scene.
Does it have the means to do so? It's got a fleet in the Pacific. It's got soldiers in the Caribbean as well. Africa.
Yeah, in Africa it's different, but it overseas positions or territories, France could manage to restore, a quality political dialogue with the elected local bodies. And what is at stake is in New Caledonia is precisely that. The French state has to find a way to become much neutral in the process of decolonizing New Caledonia. What happened and what justifies the situation that we witnessed over the past weeks was that the French state no longer observed this neutrality. First, remember, President Macron appointed the president of the southern province of New Caledonia in the government, Sonia Bakless, and she is one of the leaders of the loyalist camp. Secondly,
the French losing their neutrality. We're running short on time. David Cameron, just a quick final word on this. We're in an era of exacerbated nationalism. Everyone's accusing each other of being an imperialist. Do you agree with Fred Constant earlier saying that Macron could still transform this into a win?
I think there's a possibility. I'm thinking of a statement I remember way back in 1988, hearing Jean-Marie Dubau, who was a leader of the Kanaks, saying the problem is not independence alone, it's interdependence. And that's the key. How can these different groups in society live together because they are interdependent? So seeing independence in that light, I think it's
trying to find the common ground. We'll leave it with that. David Cameron, I want to thank you. I want to thank Fred Constant for staying up late from Singapore, David Chappelle for waking up early in Hawaii, Patricia O'Brien for being with us at lunchtime in the U.S. Capitol. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.